June 1922. So after breakfast with her grandmother nearly 2 weeks after arriving back to Downton, Milo had walked to Downton village the next day to call on the Sparks. Mrs. Sparks was in the yard hanging out the washing when she saw Milo, and she dropped the towel back into her basket like a scalded cat and hurried back inside. Within minutes Mr. Sparks, leather piece still in hand, came outside. "Miss Ashby," he exclaimed, bringing out the piece of leather he was working with a cloth. "What can I do for you?" "I need to ask about the lease," Milo replied, bluntly. "I need to see your copy." She stared at Mr. Sparks, who said nothing, continued to work at his leather. His wife stared between the two of them. "I am afraid we don't have it," Mr. Sparks told her. "Mr. Crawley was taking care of it." "You know this is still my house." Mrs. Sparks looked nervously at her husband. Of course it is," Mr. Sparks replied. "I need to see my brother's things," Milo told him. "Be my guest," Mr. Sparks told her, and he gestured towards the house, and Milo strode past him, or made to, but he put his arm in front of her. "Landlords have to make an appointment to see folk," he told her severely. "That's the law of the land." "I need my brother's things," Milo told him. "They are no longer in the house," said Ms. Sparks, and she showed her the outbuilding. The things had not had care taken over them. Corrosion had set in. Milo began to get them all out. "You can't do that," Mr. Sparks called. "These are my things," she told him, with such ferocity the man looked startled. "They are neither in the lease nor are they yours." "They belonged to my brother," she said, pointedly, "and now they belong to me." She looked around forlornly. None of them would be of much use now. But the transmitters still contained the zinc sulfate coatings that he had used. It would be cheaper than Madame Curie's trip, if they still contained the radium Chadwick needed, or if the rock samples contained anything that would be an alpha-ray source. For the professor had told them that either mathematics had gone wahoo, or there was something else present in the nucleus of an atom which contributed to the heavier-than-expected mass differences. And not just in atoms, alpha particles too. A proton attached to an electron, to make a neutral particle. But how to prove it? Milo asked him, for which she was yet to receive an answer. Chadwick was working on the very thing. "They are worth something, then?" Mr. Sparks asked her. "They are worth something to me," she told him. "My brother was working with radium before he was killed," she added. "Radium is what we need down in Cambridge." She took the pieces. They had been used in the experiment that Geiger and Marston had carried out. While they had the original papers, and of course, Rutherford, Milo often wondered about Marston, killed in Gallipoli, and what he had noticed, or Geiger, because of whom Chadwick had been interned. Even then, he had managed to simulate Rutherford's experiment, using radium in toothpaste, and aluminium foil. She could not speak to Hans Geiger, not even if she could. German scientists were prevented from attending international events. But it had not stopped Milo from writing to him in Berlin, and receiving a reply. It had been in English, even though she had pored over a translation book in German. "And the lease only is valid if it can be proved on paper," Milo told Mr. Sparks. "If you cannot prove you leased my house legally, then you have no right to move my things, or be there at all." And she swept away, the unease in her stomach not eased in the slightest. 88,888,888. "I have been through all his belongings, even his cottage, and I cannot locate it," Thomas sighed. It was the night before the surprise that Lady Rose had organized for Lord Grantham. No one was supposed to know what it was. Yet, of course, food had to be arranged, and a telephone call had come through asking about where the band would be set up. "Band?" Mr. Carson had growled. And Lady Rose had told him not to worry. It was a surprise for Cousin Robert. Carson did worry, of course, and that worry had permeated through to the staff. Thomas Barrow had other things on his mind, not least his desire to help his wife in quelling her concerns. But mainly, he wanted to put one over on Tom Branson. "We must look again," Prue told him, offering more Jamesons. They had retreated to the generator building after Prue had walked Mrs. Jameson and the two Miss Jameson to the gamekeeper cottage. Although, I wonder if we haven't been altogether stupid. Thomas looked at him. You may have been, Mr. Prue, Thomas told him, but Jack Prue's expression told him that the Irishman did not share his sense of humor. He smiled to Thomas, but there was no humor in it. Have a drop of the good stuff, Mr. Barrow, and try to remember we are on the same side. Now, an intelligent person trying to conceal a document would not store it somewhere obvious. It's not in his sock drawer. No, Thomas agreed, knocking back the spirit. It is not. That's if he has it at all. You told me that you knew it was him. I did not ask why you knew. Thomas inhaled on his cigarette. He had trusted the man thus far. It was when a large box came for Lady Mary last year. Branson was close to Matthew Crawley. And Thomas continued, detailing how Tom Branson had got his way into the family through Sybil, and Robert Crawley had given him chance after chance to keep him there, for he did not want Tom to take Sibby away from Downton. If he has it, Prue concluded, then he will not chance it lying around. It will in his possessions that are dearest to him, wherever he keeps those. And Thomas reasoned where it would be. Branson had a drawer in his room, probably one operated by a switch, that was, if he wasn't carrying it around with him. Thomas knew every secret drawer, crevice and hiding place in all of the pieces of furniture in the house. Being a hall boy at Downton, at 10, Miss O'Brien had him find out secrets, find out confidential information. She had taught him, then you can second guess the master, then it will keep you safer. And Thomas wanted nothing less than a safe position at Downton, for the alternative, returning to his father, was a situation he did not wish to be in. It does not seem like him, though, Thomas told Prue. He always seems like the goody two-shoes as far as the family is concerned. Prue looked at him for what Thomas felt like a long time. Then the Irishman sucked on his cigarette. The English really do have short memories, he told Thomas. And Thomas Barrow thought back to when Branson had arrived, his socialist bent, his not caring who knew, his encouragement of Sybil to listen to the socialists at Ripon, where she got injured, his thought to embarrass the general at dinner to pass the army fitness and make a show of his displeasure at the war on his first parade. There was his attendance to revolutionary meetings in Dublin, and his taking part of the burning of houses, under this man's direction, no doubt. And it was funny how, after all his subtle boastings, that the Jamesons had succumbed to the same fate as other families, or why he was still in their attendance. How could Thomas consider taking a document pertaining to Milo, which he truly believed was his by right, to be unthinkable? All of that had been suppressed by the comfort he now found himself in. Even his own brother had seen it. Thomas Barrow shook his head, wondering how he could have forgotten all of this. All right, Thomas conceded. Yes, I do remember. Where do you suggest we begin? 88,888,888. But things did not feel better for Milo. She had shared her feelings about her house with Chadwick, and she knew she needed to sort it out. But without proof, without the lease, how could she? If she had it in her hand, she would be able to see what the law said about it. Milo closed her eyes, as she listened to her grandmother fuss over her aunts. Helen and Isabella were only about a decade older than Milo, and though they should be married, the War of Independence had fractured their social stratum. They were going to be moving to Bedford with the little money they had from the sale of their family's whiskey business. The girls would have to consider getting jobs, Margaret Jameson had told them. It also meant they had little for Robert Crawley's dinner, and Milo's grandmother had to do with what they had. Although she had asked whether Miss Baxter could call to see them and do something with their outfits. And Miss Ashby. Miss Baxter had asked her grandmother. I have a dress, grandmother, Milo put in, quickly. And she had it hung in her old room, in the wardrobe of the under-housekeeper. Her blue dress. And she meant to wear it. Oh, very well, Margaret Jameson conceded. Go, up there, as soon as possible, and change, she said, with her disapproving tone. Practical though she was, Milo favored clothing of a decade before, and shivered to see her granddaughter dressed as a woman of middle age, long sleeves, high collar, looking like a miniature dowager countess. The staff were hard at work setting up in the hall below the gallery. People milled about, and Milo tried to find Mrs. Hughes when she found the wardrobe empty. The housekeeper stopped what she was doing, which was directing two of the jazz orchestra upstairs in Mr. Molesley's company, to talk to her. I moved the clothes upstairs, at her ladyship's request, Mrs. Hughes told her. You haven't much, but you do have the blue dress of which you are so fond. Bring it down and we can help you get into that. And Milo did, stopping in surprise as a man, dark-skinned, brilliant smile, stood to one side on the stairs to let her pass. Can I help you with that? He asked, in a voice betraying his origins as America. He glanced at the dress. No, you cannot help her with that. Mr. Carson boomed from his place near the bottom of the stairs, looking at the list of arrangements. Miss Ashby, he sighed in exasperation. Take that back upstairs where it came from. But, now, bellowed Carson, and at once, her childhood horrors of the bear charging at her, swiping with huge, wide paws, filled her mind and she tore off upstairs. Where are you going? Lady Mary called, as she got to the first floor. Milo stopped. Stopping before she spoke, allowing time for her mind to catch up, rather than panic, was a trick that she had found which worked. Not that much talking was required at the Cavendish. Information seemed to be passed with economy of words. Most of the time everyone knew what they were doing and one another's part in it, so why waste time talking? Mr. Carson said I must change up here, Lady Mary, she told her. The Black Princess, she had once designated her, Milo remembered, because of her hair, probably, which so resembled the Queen, the Countess. Then you must, she told her, you can use my room. Lady Mary glanced at the frock Milo was holding. Call Anu if you insist on wearing that. You'll never do the back up yourself. With hindsight, when Milo looked back to that time, just before the jazz had begun, even in the darkest hours, when Werner, when Hans, colleagues in spirit, enemies in fact, had let her be taken from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute by the Gestapo, she wondered had there been a worse time. And that was what was about to transpire, for it colored not only that day, but the months ahead, even the years. Nothing about that memory was good. Jazz came floating up to Milo on the air as the band began to tune up. She could hear Lady Rose's voice, interspersed with happy laughter, organize the band, and formulate cloak and dagger strategies that they may not be seen until the big reveal to Lord Grantham as a surprise. So Milo went into Lady Mary's room. It was hot, and it was dry, sultry. A night for an evening walk in the gardens, to look at the flowers, which still would be open, scenting the night air to the pleasure of all. Off came her trousers and shirt, and she was down to her smalls. She pulled her slip over her shoulders and her chest, then stood in the middle of the room, while she pulled the blue silk dress onto the floor and stepped into it. Milo was just pulling the shoulders over hers, realizing that she would indeed need someone to button up the back when she saw it. A box, with the names of the two solicitors who had sent Mr. Crawley's effects back to Lady Mary. It was when she was halfway through it, the lease in her hand, pushing back all the other documents, when Milo heard a noise behind her. She seized the lease and crunched it into her hand, before making to turn. Miss Ashby, she heard Tom Branson's voice say to her. What are you doing in Lady Mary's room? Getting dressed, she told him, and was outraged, when she turned to the door, to see the man, smiling around the door. Milo pulled the dress to her. He can't do that. Sneaking around, looking at people getting dressed. You look very nice tonight, said Tom Branson, stepping into the room. Milo looked startled, and felt her heart drum in her chest. Thank you, she replied, automatically. Your necklace is beautiful, he went on. Milo held the lease tighter. Unless she did something about it, Tom Branson was about to find it, and he was the last person she wanted to know her business, considering his bitterness over losing money on her guardianship. Thank you, Milo repeated, thinking about her opals. She barely took them off these days. It was an efficient way of making sure she did not lose them. Well, you can't go down to dinner looking like that, he told her, or are you making a daring fashion statement? Milo said nothing. Rather, clasped the lease to her chest in bunched hands. He was going to find out, she knew. "I do not believe Miss Ashby wishes to speak with you anymore." Thomas's voice came low into Lady Mary's room. Branson turned, and lowered his head for a moment. Thomas came in, and looked at Milo. "In fact, do you think it is entirely appropriate for a widower to be in the same tomb room with a married woman who is trying to dress for dinner?" "Apologies, Miss Ashby," Tom Branson said, and pushed his way past Thomas as he stood in the doorway, making it difficult for him. And if only Milo had handed Thomas the lease, trusted him to help her, at that moment, things would have turned out much differently. It was not as if she didn't trust him, but at that moment, Milo did not know how to go about it quickly enough before Thomas had come into Lady Mary's room and closed the door. "You should have rung for help," he told her, doing up the buttons on what had been her wedding dress. She was still clutching the lease and, once Thomas had finished, Milo made a swift gesture and slipped it under Lady Mary's bed. "Get it later," she told herself. "Rung for help." "The bell pull," he told her. As it's Lady Mary's room, Anna would have come up. "I take it that's what Lady Mary told you?" "Yes," Milo agreed, cross with herself that she did not have that step to hand, that Lady Mary assumed Milo knew what to do to bring Anna up to help her. "Come on then, Mrs. Barrow," he teased, holding out an arm for her. "Let me escort you." They went out of the bedroom, along the gallery, they went down the back stairs, down to dinner. And Milo climbed back up again to be up onto the ground floor just in time to meet her grandmother and aunts as they arrived for the dinner, sweeping Milo up in their wake. 88,888,888. It was when the jazz and the dancing began that Milo slipped away from the party, going upstairs in order to find the lease and take it with her. People milling around disguised her departure, and she made it through the padded door and up to the back stairs. But her heart beat faster when, after crouching down to look under the bed and felt around with her hand, she found nothing. How could it be gone? She hadn't seen Lady Mary come back up, so maybe one of the servants. Or, "Are you looking for this?" The question broke into her thoughts, and Milo saw Tom Branson standing in the doorway. Her face grew cold and she started to back away, as he approached her, the lease in his hand. "And all the time, did you really think I'd let you have this?" he asked, holding it out to her. Matthew's letter details what would happen when a guardian is appointed. As Milo made to grab it, Tom Branson pushed the document into his pocket, grabbing her hair instead. "Oh no you don't," he declared, and Milo could smell whiskey on his breath as he forced her down. "Wear my Sybil's dress will ye?" he demanded, and he tore the back of it. Milo made to scream, but he slapped her face, which knocked it from her lungs. And what happened next was almost like a dream as Tom Branson, cursing the name of her grandmother's manservant, did what no man should ever do. The pain made Milo gasp as he violated her body. Einstein postulated relativity in terms of the duration spent in the company of a beautiful woman being a short-lived experience. But for Milo, thought it lasted no more than a minute, but to Milo the assault was much longer. "There," Tom Branson huffed, standing near the door when Milo turned round. What he demanded next felt worse than what he had just done to her. "Get dressed, now," he ordered, gesturing to her own clothes, dark black and high-buttoned, long-sleeved. He waited until she had stepped out of them before sweeping up what he was still calling Sybil's dress and waited for her to be clothed. But Milo was trembling as she stood momentarily in her slip, before pulling on her dress. Branson was goggling at her and strode over to her and put his hands to her waist, doing up the buttons. "No harm done?" he insisted, scooping up Milo's torn dress. Then he bolted to the door, leaving it to swing back on its hinges. Milo looked down, her head filled with flashes of images of what had transpired. He had stolen the lease, stolen her dress. Done heaven knew what to her, violently and forcefully. She held her head and shook it, picturing the lease again. She needed to follow him, and quickly. So Milo lifted her skirt to one side and began to hurry towards the door. But before she got there, to turn the knob, it opened from the other side. Lady Mary, carefree as she came in, changed her features to angry, indignant. Milo froze, clutching the fabric of the dress. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, giving Milo a foul look. But before Milo could answer, Tom Branson loomed behind her. "Oh, I am sorry, Lady Mary," he lied. "I saw Melusina coming up. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen." Mary turned back to Milo, vehemence in her eyes. "You think, just because you installed electrics here you can have the run of this place?" She pushed Milo's shoulder. Milo took a step back, feeling bewilderment strike her. That wasn't true. She hadn't. And she sorted in her mind what to say, how to say it, with the man who had done that lingering behind Lady Mary. "What were you doing?" "I am sorry to say I found her going through Lady Sybil's things," lied Tom Branson. "But this is completely out of order," Lady Mary shouted. "Stay away," she declared. "Stay well away, you ungrateful, selfish brat." And Milo watched Tom Branson stalk away as she berated her. "Thomas!" Milo exclaimed, anger filling her at the injustice of all of this. She saw her immediate world as it really was, with someone stealing from her, hurting her, twisting the truth against her, angry at Tom Branson, who had used her. Lady Mary, who had no idea about life except for what she believed, and what she believed was her brother-in-law. Thomas had told her Lady Mary needed to be heeded because she had lost her husband. But, Milo thought, so had other people. And the person she needed most, to explain what had happened, had come into view behind Mary Crawley. But she did not have time to say anything to him before Lady Mary took her assumptions and used them as weapons against Milo for her alleged misdemeanors. "Barrow!" Lady Mary exclaimed. "If you have any influence over her, now is the time to use it." Milo looked between Mary Crawley and Thomas Barrow. She needed words now, to express what had happened to her, to explain, to reverse the steamroller that was Lady Mary's arrogance in believing she had the measure of the situation and that she, Milo, just had to squash down and accept her place in that narrative of events. "It's not true," she declared, looking at the wake where Tom Branson had walked. Shuddering, shaking, she looked between them. "Someone Thomas Mary ask her for her version of the events. Give her a way in." "Milo," scorned Thomas. "You've brought this on yourself, behaving like this. You're not 5 anymore." But Milo would hear no more. Treading on Mary Crawley's foot in haste to get away, she heard the woman protest after her. "Stay away," Lady Mary added. "Why did I ever try to help you, you ungrateful thing? And while you are at it, remove that monstrosity from the church roof." It took Milo an hour to get to Downton village. The church was locked, as usual, but she knew a way inside, by reaching down to the back door and using a stick to maneuver the lock open. But it was at the top of the church spire steps that she gave up, her transmitter waving in the night breeze. Milo's next move was to use the small ladder that allowed her to get to the top. But when she tried a few steps she found she could not go on. It pained too much. Her insides hurt where he had hurt her. And it wasn't even for anything. Milo was no closer to getting the lease than she had been before, and Tom Branson knew he couldn't do anything legally with it himself. With leaden steps Milo made her way back to Crawley House, the servant reluctant to let her in at that hour. "My belongings are in the second room on the left," Milo insisted when he had tried to close the door on her. "Therefore if you insist I sleep in the garden I will be in need of everything in the wardrobe, on the dressing table and its top drawer." Perhaps the look of mania in her demeanor had made him relent. No point waiting until the morning, Milo thought, and she couldn't face Mrs. Crawley. The woman, who was so good and so patent, would ask her what the matter was, and Milo would confide. And then she would go with the story to Downton Abbey. In a whirl of injustice, only for Milo's word to be denied most vehemently by Lady Mary, by the Dowager Countess, by Tom Branson, and even, Milo hated to admit, Thomas. And if her husband would not back her, then that would be enough in everyone's mind to convict her of telling lies, and any notion of the actual events that had transpired would evaporate to nothing, so that would bring her James and family pain to hear things which would make them think ill of her. Rather it seemed that she was abrupt and hasty and desperate to get back to work than be sentenced by the self-appointed judge that was Lady Mary Crawley, with the will of no one to gainsay her. So, as well as a short note thanking Mrs. Crawley for her unfailing hospitality, Milo undid her watch and unclasped her opal necklace, placing one beside the other next to the letter. Not her ring, however, it had been her mother's, and Milo was her mother's. She regretted not seeing her grandmother before she left, but her place was not here, though she grieved her house. Milo left, walking the half-mile from Crawley House to the railway station. What had been the worst was Thomas. He had been so cold, so terrible, with what he had said. But there was one thing. Tom Branson might have forced himself on her in his anger, as a foul in reality as Milo had ever imagined, but her anxiety over her house was nothing to the desperation he must have felt about losing his lucrative position of being her guardian. And that was what the attack had really been about. And he had cursed Prue. She would have good cause to remember Prue's unfailing support for her in the future, but that day, vulnerable both in mind and body, Milo's only thought was to get away. She was going and vowed never again to return. So, stepping onto the train bound for York, and an hour later for Cambridge, Milo had with her Blackett's work complete, and a desire to never ever leave the Cavendish again.